They said a canine dog is trained to protect the streets, not a family. But no one ever asked what happens after the sirens fade. When a broken officer comes home to an empty house and the only one waiting for him has 4 paws and never asks questions. Before the uniform is touched, the dog already knows. And before the world changes forever, this silent partner will make a choice no training ever taught him. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Cold rain tapped the porch rail, and the street light outside Daniel Walker's small house turned the wet pavement into a dull ribbon of gold. Daniel Walker was 41, tall in a way that came from years of standing through other people's emergencies, shoulders set under a dark navy K9 jacket that still carried a faint smell of vinyl seats and winter air. His hair was cut close, brown with gray, beginning at the temples, and a day's stubble lived along his jaw as if it belonged there. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice stayed low and measured, like a man who had learned that words could spill pain if held carelessly. Since Emily died, 36, clear-eyed, strong in a quiet way, a hospital nurse who wore simple cardigans and steady shoes, Daniel had moved through life like someone walking on glass. He kept the lights dim. He kept the radio off. He learned how to cook for one hand while the other held a toddler, how to smile for Lucas, even when his own face felt heavy. Work kept him upright. Home asked him to feel. Most nights he chose work, even when he was off the clock, because feeling still sounded like loss. Shadow was the only one who never asked Daniel to explain. A German shepherd, 6 years old, black and tan, with a thick coat that held the scent of grass and rain, Shadow moved with a quiet power that never needed to announce itself. A plain black leather collar sat at his neck, a small metal tag clicking softly when he shifted. In the mornings, Shadow waited near the hall that led to the closet, chin on his paws, breathing slow, listening to the house breathe back. Daniel had noticed it long ago. The dog's ears would lift before Daniel even touched the hanger, as if the uniform had a sound only Shadow could hear. When the polished boots met the floor, the tail stopped. The eyes sharpened. Not excitement, purpose. On duty, Shadow became still as stone. At home, he followed Lucas at a patient distance, careful around small hands. Sometimes his nose pressed to the child's blanket, then he backed away, satisfied. Daniel didn't know how a dog could hold 2 worlds so gently, but Shadow did it every day, without complaint, without ceremony. That night, Daniel stood in the kitchen and listened to rain settle into a steady rhythm. It ran down the window in thin lines, turning the yard into a blur. He traced the rim of his coffee mug, then the edge of his wristwatch, small habits that kept his mind from drifting too far. The silence in the house was not empty. It was full of what used to be there. Emily's steps, the way she checked the locks twice, the faint smell of soap on the towels she folded, the soft click of her nail against a light switch. Daniel carried guilt like a second badge. He told himself he should have been faster, should have chosen a different route, should have heard the danger sooner. Lucas slept down the hall, 3 years old, small, soft-haired, wearing a light hoodie even indoors because he liked the hood. Daniel watched his son from the doorway and felt a fear he couldn't name, that love was something he might fail at twice, and that the boy would learn to live in silence the way Daniel had. Before dawn, Daniel opened the closet. The uniform hung there like a decision he had to make every day. He reached for it, and Shadow was already on his feet, not eager, not restless, just ready. Daniel clipped the leash, checked the fit by touch, and felt responsibility settle into his hands. Outside, cold air stung his lungs, and the cruiser's interior held the familiar mix of disinfectant and dog hair. The dash lights painted Daniel's knuckles pale. He started the engine, then glanced back once. Shadow sat upright in the rear seat, ears forward, body still, eyes scanning the dark as if it were a map. Daniel didn't pray the way he used to, but he found himself whispering a simple promise anyway, that he would come back, that he would stay gentle, that he would learn how to be present in his own house. Shadow didn't move. He only watched, steady as a heartbeat, and in that steadiness Daniel felt, for the first time in a long while, the shape of trust returning. Soft morning light slid across the living room floor, catching dust in the air and the grain of old wood as the house learned how to breathe with one more heartbeat inside it. Daniel Walker did not remember the moment Lucas became the center of the house. It happened quietly, the way real changes do. The boy was small, 3 years old, with light hair that refused to lie flat and hands that reached before he spoke. Daniel carried him on one hip, the weight familiar and new all at once. He learned the rhythm of bottles warming, the hush of late-night footsteps, the careful closing of doors. His voice softened around the child, though he did not notice when it happened. He still wore the same dark navy K9 jacket even at home, as if it were armor, and the stubble on his jaw had gone from habit to shield. People said he was doing well. He nodded and thanked them. Inside, he felt split, half standing guard, half afraid of failing at the one thing that mattered now. He loved Lucas fiercely, and that love made him clumsy. It made him tired. It made him forget that someone else in the house had learned his steps long before the child had. Shadow felt the shift before Daniel did. The German shepherd was 6, broad through the chest, his black and tan coat catching the light in quiet patterns. He watched from doorways and corners, ears moving like antennae tuned to a language of breath and footfall. When Lucas cried, Shadow lifted his head. When Daniel paced the hallway, Shadow rose and followed, then stopped, uncertain, when Daniel did not look back. The leash stayed on its hook longer. The evening walks grew shorter. Without protest, Shadow moved his blanket from beside Daniel's bed to the corner of the living room. He slept with his nose tucked under his tail, listening. Daniel noticed the empty space beside the bed one night and felt a pinch of guilt he did not have time to name. He told himself this was how families worked. Priorities changed. He told himself Shadow understood. Days stacked into weeks. Daniel learned to read the quiet between Lucas's breaths at night, to sit on the floor and build towers that were meant to fall. He learned to be still for the boy in a way he had never been still for himself. But stillness had a cost. When he reached for his coffee mug in the morning, Shadow was no longer there, waiting by the closet. The dog stood farther back now, as if making room. Daniel missed the weight of that presence and hated himself for missing it when the child needed him more. One afternoon he caught Shadow watching Lucas sleep, head lowered, eyes soft but steady. The dog did not approach the crib. He did not retreat either. He held a respectful distance, like a sentry who had accepted a new post without orders. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. He knelt and ran a hand along Shadow's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "You're okay," he said, mostly to himself. Shadow did not wag. He leaned into the touch, just enough. That night rain returned, light and patient. Daniel sat on the couch, Lucas asleep against him, a small weight that warmed his chest. The house smelled of clean cotton and the faint trace of dog. Shadow lay nearby, awake. Daniel studied the dog's outline in the dim, the way the ears twitched at every sound, the way the breathing stayed even. He realized then that Shadow was not stepping back. He was stepping into a wider circle. There was room for all of them if Daniel learned how to make it. He rose carefully and carried Lucas to the crib. Shadow followed, stopping where the light fell, silent as a thought. Daniel stood there longer than he meant to, listening to the rain, feeling the truth settle. Love did not divide. It expanded, and in that expansion he made a quiet promise, to see what had always been there, to speak gratitude with his hands when words failed, and to trust that the house could hold more than one kind of devotion at a time. Late afternoon light pooled on the staircase, turning each wooden step a deeper shade of amber as the house settled into its quiet. Shadow learned Lucas the way he had once learned Daniel, by listening first. He followed the boy at a respectful distance, close enough to be useful, far enough to let him believe he was alone. Lucas moved through the house on unsteady feet, 3 years old and curious, his small body wrapped in a light hoodie that dragged at the sleeves. Shadow, 6 and steady, matched the boy's pace with a patience that came from years of waiting at doors and corners. His black and tan coat caught dust and light, his ears tuned to the soft sounds of breath and wood. When Lucas slept, Shadow lay near the crib, not touching, eyes open. When Lucas woke, Shadow rose with him, silent. Daniel watched this from the edges of rooms, a tall man with a tired gaze, his canine jacket still his second skin. He felt pride and something sharper beneath it, a fear that he was no longer the only one being guarded. The moment came without warning. Lucas had learned the stairs, or so Daniel thought. He turned away for a breath, long enough to hear a soft scrape of fabric on wood. Shadow moved faster than Daniel had ever seen him move inside the house. He placed his body across the step, broad chest blocking the way, a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, not a bark, just a warning shaped like breath. Daniel's voice cut the air, rough with surprise. He told Shadow to back away. He felt the old instinct rise, the one that demanded control. Shadow did not move. He held the line, eyes steady, tail still. Lucas sat down, confused but unharmed. When Daniel reached them, the truth arrived with a quiet force. Shadow had not disobeyed. He had decided. Daniel knelt, hands shaking, and saw the world as it was, narrower, more fragile. He pressed his forehead to the banister and let the fear pass through him. After that, Daniel began to watch differently. He noticed how Shadow placed himself between Lucas and sharp corners, how the dog's head turned at every sound the boy made. He noticed the restraint. Shadow never crowded. He waited. One evening they sat in the yard as the sun went thin and pale. Lucas rolled a ball across the grass, laughing when it bounced away. Shadow tracked it with his eyes, muscles ready, the old desire bright and familiar. That ball had been a reward once, a promise kept at the end of hard days. Lucas reached out with both hands, fingers open, asking without words. Shadow lowered his head. He opened his mouth. The ball fell into the boy's lap. No command, no training, just choice. Daniel felt the weight of that choice settle in his chest. A dog known for holding on had learned how to let go. That night, Daniel cleaned the kitchen while Lucas slept. Shadow lay nearby, awake, the house breathing around them. Daniel spoke softly, not to give orders, but to name what he had seen. His voice was older than he remembered, steadier, grateful. He thanked Shadow. The dog lifted his head, met Daniel's eyes, then rested again, duty fulfilled. Daniel understood then that protection was not always loud. Sometimes it was a body placed just so. Sometimes it was a thing released. He stood at the doorway of Lucas's room and watched Shadow take his post, a quiet figure in the light. Daniel made a promise he would keep, to trust what love became when it grew wiser, and to honor the guardian who had chosen this family as his own. A hush settled over the house, the kind that presses on the ears as if even the walls had decided to listen. Daniel Walker felt the silence before he understood it. It came to him as a wrongness, a pause where sound should have been. He stood in the hallway, tall and still, his dark canine jacket hanging loose on his frame, the stubble on his jaw catching the late light. The house smelled of clean wood and cooling air. Lucas's laughter was missing. So was the soft scrape of toy wheels on the floor. Daniel called his son's name once, then again, his voice calm by habit, uneasy beneath it. Shadow rose from his place without a sound, ears forward, body already angled toward the dining room. Daniel followed, each step measured, as if rushing might break something fragile. He told himself this was how fear began, with imagination, with old loss returning uninvited. He told himself to breathe. Lucas sat on the floor near the table, legs folded awkwardly, small hands wrapped around a framed photograph. The glass caught the light, reflecting Daniel's face back at him from another time. In the picture, he stood younger, straighter, in full uniform, one hand resting on Shadow's broad back. Shadow lay now between Lucas and the doorway, his body stretched across the floor like a quiet boundary. The German shepherd's black and tan coat held the light softly. His eyes stayed on Daniel, steady and unreadable. Lucas traced the edges of the frame with careful fingers, his voice barely a whisper. "Daddy's at work," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Then, after a breath, "If you don't come back, will Shadow stay with me?" Daniel stopped where he stood. He did not trust his legs to move him closer. Time folded in on itself. Daniel remembered nights when he had come home hollow, uniform heavy with things he could not name. He remembered Emily's voice telling him to sit, to eat, to stay. He remembered the call that took her away, and the months after, when Shadow had slept at the foot of the bed, eyes open, guarding what remained. Now the dog guarded something new. Not a house, not a job, a promise. Daniel felt the old guilt rise, sharp and familiar. And then something else, relief edged with gratitude. Shadow had become the bridge Daniel could not always be. He stepped into the room at last. Shadow shifted, just enough to make space, never breaking his watch. Lucas looked up. Daniel knelt and pulled his son close, breathing in the scent of soap and dust. He pressed his lips to Lucas's hair and found words he could carry. "I come back," he said, "and when I can't, you're never alone." Later, when the light thinned and the house found its evening shape, Daniel sat at the table with the photograph between his hands. Shadow lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded but listening. Daniel spoke quietly, as if the past could hear him. He thanked Shadow, not as a handler, but as a father who had learned what guardianship really meant. Shadow lifted his head once, met Daniel's gaze, then settled again, duty done. Daniel felt the knot inside him loosen. He understood now that love traveled along invisible lines, tying one heart to another, even across absence. He stood at Lucas's door that night and watched Shadow take his place on the floor, a calm shape in the dim. Daniel made a vow that felt steady and true, to keep returning, to forgive himself when he failed, and to trust the bond that held his family together when his hands could not. A pale sunrise slipped through the curtains, warming the quiet rooms, as the house prepared itself for a new beginning. By the time spring arrived, the Walker house had learned a softer rhythm. Daniel Walker moved through it with less caution now, his tall frame no longer braced against loss, his shoulders easing beneath the same dark canine jacket that had once felt like armor. He was older in ways that had nothing to do with years. The gray at his temples showed more clearly in the morning light, and his stubble came slower, as if even his face had learned patience. He spoke gently these days, his voice steady, warmed by use. Lucas followed him from room to room, 4 years old now, taller, louder, carrying toy cars and questions in equal measure. And Shadow, 6 years strong, black and tan coat, brushed by habit rather than duty, watched it all from the spaces between. Daniel had started calling him the first son, half in humor, half in truth. The words felt right in his mouth. Shadow answered with a quiet look, ears forward, accepting the name as he accepted everything else, without fuss, without pride. The days leading up to the birth were filled with waiting. The air outside smelled of wet earth and new grass. Rain came and went, tapping gently at the windows like a reminder to be present. Daniel packed and unpacked the hospital bag more than once, his hands slower, careful. He thought often of Emily in those moments, of her strength, her tired smile after long shifts, the way she had trusted him with more than he believed he deserved. Shadow stayed close, never underfoot, always aware. At night he slept near Lucas's bed, body curved protectively, breathing even. Daniel watched this from the doorway, feeling something settle inside him. He was no longer afraid of being replaced. He had learned that love did not push outward. It gathered, it held. When the baby arrived, the world narrowed to simple things. A quiet room, clean sheets, the sound of breath learning itself. Daniel stood beside the hospital bed, holding a small life wrapped in white, his hand steady, his eyes full. Back home the house waited. When they returned, the light was low and kind. Daniel placed the new crib beside the old one, wood pale against the wall. He stepped back unsure. Shadow approached without instruction. He circled once, then lay down between the two cribs, his broad body forming a gentle barrier, his head resting on his paws. No one told him where to be. He had always known. Daniel sank into a chair and let the tears come, quiet and complete. That evening, as the sun slipped toward the horizon, Daniel stood at the window. The yard glowed gold. Lucas played nearby, his laughter soft, careful not to wake the baby. Shadow lifted his head, eyes following the light, then settled again. Daniel thought back to the man he had been, the one who came home hollow, who mistook silence for strength. He understood now that guardianship was not about command, or even presence, but about choosing to stay open. He placed a hand over his heart and felt it answer. The past no longer pulled at him. It stood behind, steady. In the fading light, Daniel made his final promise. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. To keep loving. To forgive himself. To trust the quiet watchfulness that had carried them here. The house breathed. Shadow kept watch. And the family, whole at last, rested inside the kindness of that stillness. As this story ends, remember that many quiet hearts are still living it every day. Loneliness, illness, and fading strength can make the world feel smaller, but love still finds its way in gentle forms. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs comfort, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. May God bless you, keep you safe, and bring peace, health, and companionship into your days.